Let's move on to what I think are more significant. I find the reference in Luke to Jerusalem being surrounded by armies to be the most convincing parallel to the Josephine account. Something that both preterists and many futurists can agree. For example, Kenneth Gentry says, quote, the context of Luke demands a literal Jerusalem besieged by, I like these terms. I want you to hear this real good from a preterist because we're going to say more about literal and figurative in a moment. He's insistent on this. He says, well, there's a literal Jerusalem besieged by literal armies in literal Judea, which was a matter of indisputable historical record occurring in the events leading up to AD 70. So he's a real stickler on literal. Thomas Ice says in response, this demonstrates that preterists take Scripture literally, unless it contradicts their presupposed system of theology, at which time they usually come up with a more pliable, deeply spiritual meaning of the text. And I'm going to point this all out to you here in just a moment. I thought this was really an interesting sort of division. But since both preterists and futurists like myself, that's Tommy speaking, believe that Luke 21:20 through 24 literally refers to Jerusalem in AD 70, then this can be used as a template as to how Scripture speaks of the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century. Now, I'm inclined to agree with this understanding of the passage, but even this interpretation is not required. One only needs to think of the abomination of desolation to be discussed below in Daniel being typically fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes to understand that the AD 69 through 70 siege by the Romans could be a type of a much more significant surrounding by Jerusalem in the end of days. In other words, you have, in a sense, the abomination seemingly fulfilled in some respects with Antiochus, but even Jesus says, well, not really, because it's still to come. Daniel spoke about it, so that was clearly typical. Could it not then be that this is somewhat typical of that which is even to follow also? It's possible that one could look at it that way. Christians then, let's see, where did I leave off? Let's see, I'm inclined to agree with that, but it says that part of the problem for the first century interpretation of Luke is the sequencing of events. Observe this order. Quote, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her dissolution is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, but those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must enter the city. Now here I'm trying to give, if I take it to be literally the AD 70 event, and that this is what Luke is talking about rather than it being typical of a later event, then I do have a couple of problems that maybe can be solved by some others here. Padfield interprets the text as saying, when the Roman army is coming to Jerusalem, hear the difference? I read Luke's passage where it says, when you see it surrounded, then do something. Padfield dealing with it says, when the people see the Roman army coming toward Jerusalem, then they're to do something. And I said, we don't have agreement there. I guarantee there's a lot of difference between the army coming to your city and surrounding your city, particularly if you're trying to get out of it. Quote, here the disciples are warned that when the Roman army is approaching Jerusalem, they were to flee for their lives. Christians receive ample warning about the approaching invasion. But the text actually says something quite different. That is, when, and then. Luke says that after the city of Jerusalem is already surrounded, people were to flee Judea. Note the description of Josephus. And I'm not going to give you the whole quote. I have a long quote here, but basically what this says is that he explains how it is that the Roman army covered the area. How many 5 miles? It was 40 furlongs, so about 5 miles of trenches around and walls around and guards around the city to make sure nobody could get out. And so there's a whole description in Josephus about how he did that. On the next statement also, he says he continues by describing the length of the wall and how the army has fortified it. Now, going on then. If Luke 21 speaks of the destruction of Jerusalem, this passage has support from the writings of Josephus in a manner differently from Matthew 24, I should say, and Mark 13. So get me? If Luke 21 is in fact talking about the destruction of Jerusalem then that does fit Josephus in some respects. See? But on the other hand, if this is talking about a later time, it doesn't. And clearly Mark and Matthew 24 and Mark 13 do not fit it. Luke 21 is an expansion of what is only a brief mention at the beginning of the synoptic parallels. The terminus ad quo is the surrounding of the city of Jerusalem by armies, and the terminus ad quem is the completion of the temple times of the Gentiles, which has only occurred recently. And that's another issue I have. It will be, basically kept, it will not have this freedom and independence until the time of the Gentiles has been complete. What about Great Tribulation? It is with difficulty that I do not enter into a more developed biblical exegesis in this paper, but my focus is whether the writings of Josephus record what is spoken of as the Olivet Discourse. There is considerable data in the little apocalypses, as I'm saying Matthew 24, Mark 13, that deserves attention. For my purpose, however, we need to discuss only one matter: the severity of the destruction of Jerusalem. Papfield says of the terrible slaughter and devastation of Jerusalem that people have often underestimated the severity of the Roman war against Jerusalem. There was great slaughter, destruction of the city, and blood in the streets. Approximately 1 million Jews died and 97,000 were carried into slavery. Now, no one can doubt the awesome devastation and death heaped upon Jerusalem by the Romans. My question is whether this destruction qualifies to fulfill the words of Jesus. Quote, "For then there will be great tribulation." That's after these things I've talked about. "There will be great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." The slaughter of millions before and since the destruction of Jerusalem has equaled and surpassed what occurred to the Jews in Jerusalem in AD 70. The apocalyptic horror foretold in a future war is more in view, in my opinion. That is, I think you can find many instances in the world and time in which there has been devastation on this magnitude. And what we find Jesus saying, it says, when that really happens, it will be such that will never ever be repeated. Nothing will ever be as great. And I suspect that there have been many instances of far more significance. I mean, I'm not minimizing what happened in Jerusalem, but there's been far more death and devastation than what one observed there. Now, the stars will fall from heaven. While preterists are content to interpret quite literally these events that precede Matthew 24:29, remember I had Gentry, literally, well, they'll say all those are literal. For some reason, the remainder of the Matthean text is to be taken symbolically. In a slap at premillennialists, one says of these happenings, "To those unfamiliar with prophetic language, the premillennialists," this is a quote, should be a quote here, it's not in the text there. "To those unfamiliar with prophetic language, the premillennialists sometimes sound convincing. However, a short trip through the Old Testament will show how similar language was used to describe the fall of monarchs and nations," end quote. So all these things that we're going to see in a moment here, those aren't literal happenings. I mean, the falling from the sky and all the wars, all these things are literal because you've got to take them that way. But all these other things are not literal. That's talking about the rise and fall of nations. Okay. Apparently, since I'm a premillennialist, my understanding of prophetic language is somewhat limited. But I did compare the text he provides in his article and found no reason not to take most of them as literal in nature. That is, when I read the text, I said, so what? I think Dr. LaHaye maybe this morning, someone said, when the Scripture makes sense, seek no other sense, lest it be nonsense. Well, that's what we're talking about. When I read these passages, he said, oh, those got to be symbolical. I said, well, I can take them quite literally. Now, when I say literal fulfillment, I'm not doubting one may have figurative language to state a literal truth. But no passage of literature, even poetry, may be predominated with a metaphor or simile or the like, or the texts make no sense. You cannot have a text with just full of figurative language, or you lose meaning in a text. It must be the exception, not the rule.